I always wanted to be a wildland fire investigator for as long as I can remember. Being out in the field, documenting burn patterns, reading smoke, and piecing together what fire did and why it did it. That was pretty much all I wanted to do once I realized the job existed, and I trained for it the way other people train for the Olympics. I spent 19 years doing that work. 19 years writing fire behavior reports for the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and 3 state agencies. I knew what fire did and what it did not do, and I was good at documenting the difference. Then I wrote a report in Elko County, Nevada, about a fire that had exhibited retrograde burn behavior and left no char on a section of ground it had visibly crossed. I wrote what I saw. The report was quietly removed from the agency database. I was offered a reassignment. I declined. And I spent the following 3 years doing seasonal lookout work for different forests, while the investigation career I had built over 2 decades was allowed to quietly lapse. Now I was 44 years old and stationed alone at Dry Forks Lookout Tower in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in central Idaho, watching 2.3 million acres of canyon country through a brass instrument that hadn't changed since 1940. The tower cab was 14 feet by 14 feet, steel framed with 360-degree glass, perched on a 40-foot steel tower at 7,200 feet above sea level. It had a single-burner propane stove in the northwest corner, a cot in the southeast corner, a shelf of radio equipment along the east wall, and the Osborne fire finder at the center of the floor. The Osborne was a brass azimuth ring, an alidade bolted directly to the cab floor, the kind of instrument that still worked because it had no moving parts that could fail. In every direction, forested drainages dropped away into shadow below the ridgeline. Beyond them were more ridges, and beyond those more drainages, and no paved road for 60 miles in any direction. The nearest trail was 6 miles north. In fire season, the sky was a whitened blue that turned deep orange at dusk from smoke somewhere distant, and the silence between radio check-ins was total and specific, the kind of silence that had weight. I had been here 31 days. I was good at being alone in high places, and I was good at watching. The only human presence in my life out here was Maria Vega, by simple arithmetic. She was the only one. Maria was the dispatch coordinator at the Clearwater Nez Perce National Forest Dispatch Center in Grangeville. She had been on the job for 20 years. Her voice on the radio was dry and precise and carried a permanent undertone of mild amusement at the world. Our morning check-ins were officially 90 seconds of weather data and visibility conditions. They ran 25 minutes. She knew I took my coffee without sugar because the resupply mule had brought me the wrong canister 2 weeks running and I hadn't complained. I knew she kept a topographic map of the entire ranger district pinned to the wall behind her desk and had marked every fire event she'd dispatched in the last decade with a red pin. I was at the Osborne at 0840 on a Tuesday in early July when the smoke column appeared in the Kettle Fork drainage. Clean gray-white, single-point ignition, textbook. I had the coordinates logged and Maria on the radio inside 40 seconds. Dry Forks to Grangeville Dispatch, I said.
Go ahead, Dry Forks.
I have a smoke column, Kettle Fork drainage, bearing 172 degrees, estimated 11.3 miles. Single point of origin, white-gray column, light wind drift to the northeast.
Copy that,
Maria said. Her voice was dry and efficient and entirely normal.
Logging at 0841. I'll get resources moving. Stay on it.
Will do. I set the radio back on the shelf and returned to the Osborne to watch. For the first 4 hours, the Kettle Fork fire behaved exactly as a fire in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness should behave in the 3rd week of a dry July. It spread northeast along the canyon floor with the 6-knot upslope wind. The smoke column stayed white-gray and vertical. I monitored the infrared camera image on the small monitor beside the alidade, a broad heat mass, growing steadily, normal fire behavior. I checked the wind again at 1100 hours, still 6 knots upslope. No change. The column was thicker now, the heat signature on the infrared spreading in a clean northeast pattern. 40 acres, maybe 45 at peak. I logged the observation in my notebook and went back to watching. At roughly 1300 hours, the fire stopped spreading. I watched the infrared image hold steady for 10 minutes. The heat mass wasn't growing anymore. It wasn't contracting either. It was just sitting there, static, which wasn't normal but wasn't unheard of. Sometimes a fire hits a fuel break or a change in topography and pauses before finding a new direction. I checked the wind again. Still 6 knots upslope. Unchanged. No rain. No humidity spike. The conditions were the same as they'd been all morning. Then the infrared image began to contract. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching the glowing mass on the screen draw inward. It was shrinking toward the origin coordinates I had logged that morning. Not spreading in a new direction, not holding steady. Shrinking. The smoke column thinned. I could see it through the glass with my naked eye. The column that had been thick and vertical all morning was pulling in on itself, getting narrower, fading. I stood at the Osborne and stared south through the telephoto binoculars I kept mounted on a tripod beside the alidade. The Kettle Fork drainage was invisible from the tower floor, a hidden cut in the landscape 11 miles south, folded into the canyon system below the ridgeline. I could see smoke when it rose. I could not see the ground. I was watching something through a keyhole. By 1500 hours, the Kettle Fork was dark and still. The infrared monitor showed no heat signature. The smoke column was gone. The drainage sat quiet and empty under the whitened blue sky, and there was no evidence on any instrument I had available that a fire had been burning there 4 hours earlier. I stood at the Osborne, the infrared monitor dark, the Kettle Fork drainage invisible 11 miles south, and I understood that what I had just watched a fire do was not something fire does. I called Maria back on the radio and told her the Kettle Fork fire was gone. She was quiet for a moment. Not long, but enough. Then she said,
I see it on the remote camera feed. I'll log it as a natural knockdown.
Her voice had changed. Not much. Enough. I said, It hasn't rained in 11 days, Maria. She said,
I know. Log it as knockdown.
The channel went quiet. I set down the radio handset and stood there in the cab for a minute, not moving. The afternoon light was coming through the glass at an angle now, throwing shadows across the Osborne's brass ring. I was thinking about Oliver Larson. Oliver was the regional fuels manager for the Clearwater Nez Perce, based out of the Kooskia Work Center. We'd met in person exactly once, a 40-minute briefing in a conference room in late May, 2 weeks before the season started. He'd told me the Dry Forks tower assignment was not primarily about fire detection. The tower was staffed because something had been happening in the Kettle Fork drainage, and they wanted a human observer with a credible cover story. He'd given me a code phrase, smoked out, to use if I observed something in the Kettle Fork I couldn't explain. He'd told me to route any Kettle Fork observations directly to him, not through normal Forest Service channels. He'd said all of this in the tone of a man reading from a document he had not written and did not endorse. He'd looked uncomfortable the entire time. I picked up my phone and dialed Oliver's direct line. He picked up on the second ring. I had the impression he'd been waiting. I said, smoked out. He said,
How many acres?
I told him, 40, maybe 45 at peak. He said,
Good. That's a small one.
Then he hung up. I stood in the cab with the phone in my hand. Outside the 360-degree glass, the Bitterroot ridges ran south in every direction, forested and still. Somewhere 11 miles down in the canyon system, the Kettle Fork drainage lay folded into the landscape, invisible, keeping its own counsel. I had done what I was told to do, called the code phrase, reported the acreage. The conversation had lasted 20 seconds and told me nothing. I put the phone down and returned to the Osborne. I stared south at the ridgeline for the rest of the afternoon. The sky went orange at dusk from distant smoke. I could smell it faintly through the open window on the north side of the cab. That familiar summer smell of fire season, Wood smoke carried on thermals from some blaze burning 50 or 100 miles away. I ate dinner without tasting it. Rice and canned vegetables heated on the propane stove. I sat at the small folding table and looked at the kettle fork through the southern glass while I chewed. I did not call anyone else. I was aware that both Maria and Oliver knew more than they'd said. I was aware that neither of them had said anything useful. I was aware that I was 11 miles from the thing that had happened and could not see the ground. The light faded slowly, the orange deepening into red and then into purple, the ridges going dark against the sky. The infrared camera showed nothing in the kettle fork. No heat signature, no lingering hotspots. The drainage was cold and still. I stood at the Osborne in the last of the orange dusk light, the kettle fork invisible below the ridgeline, the radio silent, with Oliver's 20-second phone call and Maria's changed voice the only answers I had been given. The second kettle fork event happened 5 days after the first. I was at the Osborne when the smoke column appeared, 90 acres at peak according to my best estimate, and it behaved exactly like the first one had. Clean ignition, textbook spread pattern for about 4 hours, and then the contraction started. The column thinned. The infrared camera showed the heat mass drawing back toward the origin point, and by late afternoon the kettle fork was dark and still. I called Oliver both times. The conversations were short. He asked me the acreage. I told him. He said good or noted and hung up. That was it. No questions about the contraction behavior. No requests for additional documentation. Just the acreage, acknowledgement, and silence. I started timing them after that. I also started mapping the origin points on a hand-drawn chart I taped to the wall above the Osborne. The coordinates were within 200 meters of the first event, at the base of a specific canyon wall in the lower kettle fork. Same spot, same behavior. Whatever was happening down there was happening in one place, and it was happening repeatedly. The third event came 9 days after the second. By then I had the telephoto lens mounted and aimed south. It was a 400mm lens I'd brought for bird documentation. Personal equipment, not issued. I'd thought maybe I'd see some golden eagles or peregrine falcons while I was up here. Something to photograph during the long stretches between radio check-ins. But now it was aimed at the kettle fork drainage, and I had it locked on a tripod next to the Osborne. When the smoke column appeared, I was at the lens before it was fully developed. I shot through the entire event, growth phase, peak spread, and then the contraction. I worked the frames methodically, the way I'd worked fire scenes for 19 years. Steady, sequential, no gaps in coverage. The fire contracted toward the origin point, and I kept shooting until the column was gone and the infrared camera showed nothing. I added the third origin point to my chart. 3 events, all within 200 meters of the same spot. The pattern was clear now, even if I didn't know what it meant. The fourth event arrived, and I was ready for it. I was at the telephoto lens before the column was fully developed this time. I'd been checking the kettle fork every 20 minutes all morning, and when the first wisps of smoke appeared, I was already positioned. I photographed steadily through the growth phase, watching the column rise and thicken, tracking the heat bloom on the infrared camera, and then into the contraction phase. The fire contracted toward the origin point like the others had. I kept shooting. The column thinned, the heat mass drew inward, and I worked through frame after frame, keeping the center of the burn in focus as it shrank. My hands were steady. My breathing was controlled. This was what I did. This was what I'd always done. Document everything. Miss nothing. The fire disappeared. I lowered the camera and looked at the infrared monitor. Dark. No heat signature. The kettle fork drainage was still and showed no evidence that anything had burned there 20 minutes earlier. I stayed at the Osborne until the light began to fade, watching the empty space where the fire had been. Then I went to the small folding table in the corner of the cab and opened my laptop. It took a while to transfer the files from the camera. I sat in the dimming light and waited, listening to the hard drive whir softly as the images loaded one by one onto the screen. When the transfer finished, I opened the folder and started going through the photographs, beginning with the contraction phase frames. The first few showed what I expected to see: the fire spreading, then contracting, the smoke column thinning, the tree line at the edge of the burn. Normal fire behavior captured at a distance of 11 miles through 400 millimeters of glass. Then I zoomed in. In the center of the remaining burn, in the zone the infrared camera had shown as the highest heat area, the part of any active fire where nothing organic survives, there was a shape. It was roughly man height, standing still. It had limbs, but the configuration was wrong for a standing snag. The angles were too articulated. The orientation was perpendicular to the slope rather than rooted in it. It wasn't a tree. It wasn't a rock formation. It was something else, and it was standing in the center of an active fire without burning. I went to the next frame. The shape was still there. Same position, same orientation. I went to the next frame. Still there. I counted 4 consecutive frames where it appeared clearly before the fire disappeared entirely and it was gone with it. I sat with the laptop in the dark cab for a long time. Outside, the last of the daylight was fading from the western ridges. The wilderness ran away from the tower in every direction, forested and deep and entirely silent. I could see the first stars beginning to appear in the pale sky above the Bitterroot Range. I did not call Oliver. I did not call Maria. I looked at the frames again, zooming in as far as the resolution would allow. The shape was clear enough to see limbs, arms, maybe, or something like arms, but not clear enough to see details. It was just a silhouette at the center of the highest heat, standing still while everything around it burned. I had been a wildland fire investigator for 19 years. I had documented hundreds of fire scenes. I knew what burned and what did not burn, and I knew that nothing stood upright and unaffected in the center of an active fire. Nothing. But I had the photographs. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while longer. Then I opened my pack, pulled out the personal external hard drive I kept at the bottom under my spare wool shirt, and connected it to the laptop. I copied the photographs, all of them, not just the contraction phase frames, and then disconnected the drive and put it back in the bottom of the pack, beneath the wool shirt where it wouldn't be visible if anyone looked. I did not turn the laptop back on. I did not write anything in my incident journal. I sat at the small folding table and looked out through the glass at the dark ridges and the empty sky, and I said nothing to anyone. Not that night. Not for 3 days after. What made me start pulling the historical records wasn't fear exactly. It was the investigator's reflex, the same one that had ended my career. The need to know whether what I was seeing was new. I'd been a wildland fire investigator for 19 years before I became a lookout. I'd written fire behavior reports for the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and 3 state agencies. I knew what fire did and what it did not do, and what it did not do was pull back toward its point of origin on a dry afternoon with a 6-knot upslope wind. My career had ended in 2019 after I submitted an incident report on an anomalous fire in Elko County, Nevada. It was a fire that had exhibited retrograde burn behavior and left no char on a section of ground it had visibly crossed. I wrote what I saw. The report was quietly removed from the agency database within a week. I was offered a reassignment to a desk position in Sacramento, which I declined, and I spent the following 3 years doing seasonal lookout work for different forests, while the investigation career I had built over 2 decades was allowed to quietly lapse. I was 44 years old now. I was good at being alone in high places, and I was good at watching, and I needed to know if the Kettle Fork had a history. The Selway Bitterroot Regional Archive was accessible through an older Forest Service intranet terminal built into the lookout cab's radio shelf. It was a relic of a 1990s connectivity initiative that had never been updated or secured because nobody expected anyone to use it anymore. The interface was clunky and text-based, with green letters on a black screen, and it took me 20 minutes just to figure out how to navigate the search fields. I typed in Kettle Fork drainage and hit enter. The results loaded slowly, line by line, and I felt my stomach tighten as the list grew longer. The anomalous fire events went back to 1987. I scrolled through the entries, reading the dates and the brief descriptions. The oldest logged entry described a retrograde ignition, undetermined cause. There were entries in 1991, 1994, and 1998, then a gap until 2016, after which the events became more frequent, 7 events in the following 7 years, increasing in both frequency and peak acreage. Oliver had told me the Forest Service had logged 23 events over 7 seasons. The archive showed the events went back at least 36 years before that. I sat back in the chair and stared at the screen. 36 years. This wasn't a new phenomenon. This wasn't something that had started recently and was still being understood. This was something the agency had been watching for longer than I'd been alive, and they had never told anyone about it. Not the public, not even their own employees, unless you stumbled across it the way I had. I kept scrolling. A supplemental incident file from 2003 was stored in a subdirectory labeled with a case number rather than a location name, which was why it hadn't come up in the initial search. I opened it. The file had been written by a lookout named Colin Ortiz, who had staffed the Dry Forks Tower that season. It was 3 pages of careful technical language describing a fire in the Kettle Fork that appeared to be extinguished from within, the combustion process reversing toward the point of origin without external suppression or atmospheric change. I read it twice. On the 3rd page, Ortiz had included a hand-drawn sketch. The figure in the sketch stood at the center of the contraction zone. It had limbs, but the configuration was wrong for a standing snag. The angles were too articulated, the orientation perpendicular to the slope rather than rooted in it. It had the same wrong-angle limbs as the shape in my photographs. Each page of the file was stamped in red ink across the top. Reviewed, not for distribution. I printed the file. The old printer beside the terminal whirred to life and spat out the pages slowly, one at a time, and I took them and laid them on the table beside the Osborne. Then I went back to the terminal and searched for Colin Ortiz in the agency directory. The listing showed him as a seasonal employee who had left the service in fall 2003. No forwarding information, no other records, no explanation for why he'd left or where he'd gone. He had sat in the Dry Forks cab that same season, used the same Osborne, slept on the same cot, and then he was gone. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to process what that meant. He'd filed a report. He'd documented what he saw, and then he'd disappeared from the agency's records entirely, as if he'd never existed. I picked up my personal phone and called Oliver on the direct line he'd given me during our briefing in May. It was past 11 at night, but I didn't care. He picked up on the second ring.
How many acres?
He said, his voice flat and professional, as if he'd been expecting me. I'm not calling about a fire, I said. I'm calling about a file. There was a pause.
What file?
He asked. I looked down at the printed pages on the table. A 2003 incident report from a lookout named Colin Ortiz. He described a fire in the Kettle Fork that exhibited retrograde burn behavior. He included a sketch of a figure standing at the center of the contraction zone. The file is stamped, reviewed, not for distribution. How did you get that file? The line went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where someone was thinking about what to say next, but the kind of quiet where someone was deciding whether to hang up. I waited.
How did you get that file?
Oliver said finally. I didn't answer. Oliver exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was quieter now and more tired, and it carried the weight of something he'd been holding for a long time.
There was a team,
he said.
2017. We sent 3 people into the Kettle Fork during one of the events. 2 fire behavior analysts and a botanist with a Forest Service law enforcement escort. The idea was to get ground-level data during an active contraction phase.
I waited.
The law enforcement officer came back.
Oliver said.
The 3 analysts did not. The officer's incident report described them walking toward the figure and not responding to calls to stop. He said they moved in a way that didn't look voluntary.
He paused.
His report is also not in distribution.
I felt something cold settle in my chest. Is anyone looking for them? I asked.
Officially, they were lost in the fire,
Oliver said.
Their families were told that. It was a bad year.
The line went quiet again. I sat with the phone in my hand and tried to think of something to say, but there was nothing to say. 3 people had walked into the Kettle Fork drainage and never come back, and their families had been told they died in a fire, and Oliver had known about it the entire time. Outside the cab's glass, the Bitterroot ridges ran south in every direction, forested and still, and somewhere 11 miles down in the canyon system, the Kettle Fork drainage lay folded into the landscape, invisible, keeping its own counsel. The line clicked. Oliver had hung up. I sat with the dead phone in my hand, the Ortiz file open on the intranet terminal, the stamp reviewed, not for distribution visible across the top of each page, and the wilderness outside the glass entirely still. It was Maria who pushed it forward. On a morning check-in 4 days after my call to Oliver, she told me, without preamble, that she'd been the dispatcher on record for every Kettle Fork event for the past 11 years, that she'd watched every one of them on the remote camera feed at her desk in Grangeville. 3 weeks ago, she'd recognized one of the 3 analysts named in the 2017 incident report. She'd pulled the report herself through the same intranet terminal I'd used after the first event of this season. The analyst's name was Jessica Gonzalez, and Jessica Gonzalez's husband called the Clearwater Nez Perce district office every 4 months to ask if there had been any development in his wife's case. Maria had taken those calls for 6 years. She knew his name. She knew the specific way his voice sounded when the person who answered told him there was nothing new. "I think you should go down there," she said, "between events. I think you should actually walk the origin site." I knew she was right. I'd known it before she said it. I packed 2 days' food, a water filter, my personal handheld radio, the telephoto camera, and my incident journal. I told Maria my planned route, down the east face of the ridge, into the Moose Creek drainage, south along the canyon floor to the Kettle Fork confluence, then up the lower fork to the base of the canyon wall where the origin coordinates clustered. Maria said, "I'll be on Channel 6. Check in every 2 hours." I descended at first light. The ridge face was steep and loose in places, and I picked my way down carefully, testing each foothold before committing my weight to it. The morning air was cool, and the sky above the eastern ridges was that pale, hazy blue that comes in fire season, when smoke from distant fires filters the light before it reaches you. I thought about Jessica Gonzalez walking this same drainage 11 years ago, with 2 other analysts and a law enforcement escort, and I wondered if she'd known what she was walking toward or if she'd thought it was just another field assignment. By midday, I was down in the Moose Creek drainage, following the canyon floor south. The timber here was dense Douglas fir and Engelmann spruce, with patches of open talus on the south-facing slopes where the sun hit hard and nothing grew. I checked in with Maria at noon and again at 2, giving her my position and my estimated arrival time at the confluence. The Kettle Fork confluence came up on my left just after 3. The canyon narrowed there, and the lower fork cut between walls of fractured basalt that rose steep and dark on either side. I filled my water filter at the creek and ate an energy bar standing on the bank, watching the water move over the rocks. It was quiet, ordinary looking. That had its own unease. I camped that night on a flat section of ground a mile up from the confluence, boiled water for a freeze-dried meal, and sat with my back against a spruce tree watching the light go out of the sky. The air was still and the canyon walls held the warmth of the day. I thought about the figure in my photographs, the wrong angles of its limbs, the way it stood unmoving in the center of the fire. And I wondered if it was down there now, in the origin circle, waiting, or if it only appeared when the fire came, or if the fire only came because it appeared. I didn't sleep much. At first light, I broke camp and continued up the lower fork. The timber thinned as I climbed, and the canyon walls closed in tighter. I checked the GPS coordinates every quarter mile and adjusted my route accordingly. Maria's voice on Channel 6 at 10 was steady and calm, and I told her I was close. I found the origin site just after 11 by the GPS coordinates and by the absence of vegetation. It was a rough circle approximately 30 feet across, bare compacted earth, no rock, no organic debris, no root structure visible at the surface. The soil was dry and firm and uniformly pale, as if it had been cleaned. It looked less like burned ground than like a place where burning could not take hold. I photographed the perimeter from 4 angles, then moved to the edge and crouched down. I pressed my palm to the earth. It was firm and cool and uniform. I took close-up shots of the soil texture, the way the circle's edge transitioned from bare ground to normal forest floor in the space of a few inches. At the center of the circle, lying open, was a field notebook. I walked across the bare earth to reach it. My boots left prints in the pale soil. The notebook's cover bore a Forest Service issuance stamp and the date, 2017. The handwriting inside was in blue ballpoint, careful and technical in the way a trained analyst's field notes were careful. The page it was open to read, not generating the fire, feeding it back into itself, like breathing. The combustion appears to be a byproduct of its presence, not its action. It is not burning. It is processing. The last line on the page read, "It saw us when we stopped moving." I photographed the notebook open, the page with Jessica Gonzalez's handwriting clear and precise in the frame. Then I closed it and photographed the cover, the issuance stamp, and the date visible. I was still photographing the site when my personal radio crackled on a frequency I hadn't set. Not Channel 6, not any Forest Service band I used. A man's voice said,
Mr. Gutierrez, please stay where you are.
2 people emerged from the tree line to the north. They wore unmarked green clothing close to Forest Service field gear, but not quite. The cut was different, the fabric heavier. The man who'd spoken was calm and professional. He was maybe 45, clean-shaven with the deliberate composure of someone executing a protocol. He identified himself as a contractor operating under a federal land management research agreement, and told me that I'd accessed restricted archival materials, observed classified resource events, and entered a designated exclusion zone, and that my contract with the Clearwater Nez Perce National Forest would be terminated effective immediately. The woman with him moved around the perimeter of the circle, photographing the site with a small digital camera. She hadn't spoken. "What about the 3 analysts from 2017? I asked. The contractor said, "That incident is closed." "What about Colin Ortiz?" He paused. It was the first moment that hadn't been scripted, and I registered it the way I registered everything, without showing it. "Mr. Ortiz's situation is different from yours," he said. "I'd encourage you to let this be." I looked at the notebook in my hand. I put it in my chest pocket. The contractor watched me do it and said nothing. I walked back toward the ridge, not arrested, not physically stopped. The contractor and the woman followed me to the base of the ridge and didn't follow me up. I climbed the east face in 3 hours, testing each foothold, my legs burning by the time I reached the ridgeline. I was back in the cab by late afternoon. Through the telephoto lens, I found the fire road at the wilderness boundary to the northeast. A green Forest Service adjacent pickup, no agency markings, was parked there. It was still there when the light went. I stood at the telephoto lens in the last light, the contractor's unmarked green pickup still visible on the fire road at the wilderness boundary. and Jessica Gonzalez's field notebook in my chest pocket. I sat at the small folding table beside the Osborne and wrote everything down in my incident journal first, longhand, because that was how I had always worked. The pen moving across paper was how I thought, how I processed information and made sense of things that didn't want to make sense. I started with the Ortiz file. I wrote down every detail I could remember. The careful technical language describing the retrograde ignition, the hand-drawn sketch on page 3, the figure with the wrong angle limbs standing at the center of the contraction zone. I wrote the stamp across the top. Reviewed, not for distribution. Then I wrote the archive dates going back to 1987, the oldest entry describing retrograde ignition with undetermined cause, the entries in 91, 94, and 98, the gap until 2016, the 7 events in the following 7 years. Oliver had told me 23 events over 7 seasons. The archive showed the events went back at least 36 years before that. I wrote Oliver's account of the 2017 team, the 3 analysts and the law enforcement escort sent into the Kettle Fork during an active contraction phase, the law enforcement officer who came back, the 3 analysts who did not, the officer's description of them walking toward the figure and not responding to calls to stop, moving in a way that didn't look voluntary. I wrote the contractor's name as he had given it, Floyd Marshall. I wrote his statement about Colin Ortiz word for word. Mr. Ortiz's situation is different from yours. I'd encourage you to let this be. I wrote the GPS coordinates of the origin site, the bare circle approximately 30 feet across, no rock, no organic debris, no root structure visible at the surface. The soil dry and firm and uniformly pale, as if it had been cleaned. I wrote the notebook's last line from memory. It saw us when we stopped moving. My hand was cramping by the time I finished. I set the pen down and flexed my fingers. Outside the cab's glass, the night was dark and still. No moon. The stars were bright and clean and indifferent. I picked up my personal phone and opened the voice memo application. I'd done this kind of thing before. Audio accounts for incident reports, recorded testimony for review boards. I knew how to speak clearly and at a consistent pace, how to deliver information in a way that could be transcribed and filed and used as evidence. But this was different. This wasn't going to be transcribed by an agency stenographer. This was going to be sent to 3 people who were not part of the Forest Service chain of command. 3 people who would have to decide what to do with it. I pressed record. My name is Kingston Gutierrez. I'm a seasonal fire lookout stationed at Dry Forks Lookout Tower in the Clearwater Nez Perce National Forest. This is an audio account of events occurring between June 5th and July 16th, 2023, regarding anomalous fire activity in the Kettle Fork drainage. I spoke for 22 minutes. I included Oliver Larson's name and the direct quotes from our conversation about the 2017 team, the law enforcement officer who came back, the 3 analysts who did not. The families told they died in a bad year. I included the contractor's name as he had given it, Floyd Marshall, and his statement about Colin Ortiz. Mr. Ortiz's situation is different from yours. I'd encourage you to let this be. I gave the GPS coordinates of the origin site. I described the field notebook and read the final line of handwriting aloud. It saw us when we stopped moving. I described my photographs and stated the file names and the drive they were stored on, the personal external hard drive in the bottom of my pack under my spare wool shirt. When I finished, I pressed stop and sat with the phone in my hand. The contractor's pickup was somewhere on the fire road below, parked at the wilderness boundary. I'd seen it through the telephoto lens before the light went. Floyd Marshall and the woman with him were down there, or somewhere nearby, waiting. I knew Oliver would be told about the audio file within hours of the contractor filing his report. I knew Oliver would not be able to protect me, even if Oliver wanted to. And I was not certain Oliver wanted to. He had sounded uncomfortable during that first briefing in May, reading from a document he hadn't written. but uncomfortable wasn't the same as willing to act. I knew the next intervention would not be limited to contract termination. The contractor had been professional and calm, but there had been something in his voice when he told me to stay where I was. Something that made it clear this was not a suggestion. I also knew that once I sent the file, I could not call it back. I could not quietly walk away after this. Sending it meant I was choosing to escalate, choosing to bring outside attention to something the Forest Service had been managing quietly for at least 36 years. I thought about Colin Ortiz, his careful technical language, his hand-drawn sketch, the stamp across the top of his file. I thought about Jessica Gonzalez's handwriting in blue ballpoint, describing the figure as processing combustion like breathing. I thought about her husband calling the district office every 4 months for 6 years, asking if there had been any development in his wife's case. I sent it anyway. At 0340, I sent the audio file to 3 recipients. To Bradley Silva, a former colleague who now ran a fire investigation nonprofit in Missoula called the Western Fire Accountability Project. Bradley knew which levers to pull and who to call. He had made enough enemies in the agency structure that his involvement would escalate the situation, but he would know what to do with the file. To my sister, Storm Gutierrez in Boise. She had my emergency contact information because I'd listed her on my Forest Service paperwork, but I'd never actually used it before. She would keep the file somewhere safe. She wouldn't open it unless I told her to, but she would have it. To Maria Vega at her personal email address, which she had given me in the second week of the season without explanation, in the same tone she used to give weather coordinates. Maria had been the dispatcher on record for every Kettle Fork event for the past 11 years. She had watched every one of them on the remote camera feed at her desk in Grangeville. She had told me to go down to the origin site. She deserved to know what I'd found there. The file went through. 3 confirmations. Sent. I set the phone down on the table beside the Osborne and stared at it for a long time. Outside the cab's glass, the wilderness was dark and still. The Kettle Fork drainage was 11 miles south, invisible, folded into the canyon system below the ridgeline. The contractor's pickup was somewhere on the fire road to the northeast. The bare circle was at the base of the canyon wall, 30 feet across, with no rock and no organic debris and no root structure visible at the surface. I lay down on the cot and did not sleep. At 5:20 in the morning, a smoke column rose in the Kettle Fork. I was off the cot and at the telephoto lens before it was fully light. This wasn't the subtle early morning wisp I'd seen in the previous events. This was a true fire column. 200 acres or more within the first 40 minutes, visible without the Osborne. The kind of column that would trigger automatic resource dispatch under normal protocols. I grabbed the Channel 6 radio. "Maria," I said. "Kettle Fork." She answered on the first transmission.
Go ahead.
I described the column. White-gray, vertical, maybe 200 acres already. Position, 11 miles south, base of the canyon wall, same origin coordinates as the previous events. I was reporting the way I always reported, specific, sequential, no interpretation.
Copy,
Maria said.
I'm watching it on the remote feed.
For the first hour it burned normally. The column was white-gray and vertical with the slight lean of a 6-knot upslope wind. The infrared camera showed a broad heat mass spreading northeast along the canyon floor. Textbook fire behavior. Everything about it looked exactly like a fire in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness should look in early July. Then it stopped spreading. Then the column began to thin. I adjusted the telephoto lens and found the center of the burn. The figure was there, larger than my photographs had suggested. My best estimate, calibrated against the known height of the spruce trees at the canyon edge, was 8 to 10 feet. It was entirely still, surrounded by active flame that curved inward toward it rather than outward from it. It did not move. It did not burn. It stood in the highest heat zone of a 200-acre fire and was unaffected by it in any way I had a vocabulary for. I keyed the radio. "Maria," I said, "I've got the figure. Center of the burn, 8 to 10 feet tall. The flame is moving toward it, not away from it."
"I copy,"
she said. I kept the telephoto trained on the center. The fire was contracting now, the column thinning, the heat mass pulling back on the infrared monitor. Standard retrograde behavior, same as all the others. Then, at the edge of the contracting fire, at the line where the active burn met the standing timber, 4 other figures appeared. They were moving outward, away from the center, toward the tree line. They were not burning. They were walking. I felt my hands go steady on the telephoto mount the way they always went steady when I was documenting something I didn't understand. Training. Reflex. The investigator's discipline that had ended my career and wouldn't let me look away now. "Maria," I said, 4 figures at the burn edge, north tree line, moving outward, walking." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said,
"Kingston, I need you to tell me if one of them is a woman in a yellow Nomex shirt."
I adjusted the telephoto, found the 4 figures again at the tree line. They were walking steadily into the timber on the north side of the drainage. One of them was wearing yellow. The Nomex fabric was unmistakable, the specific bright safety yellow of Forest Service fire gear, the color I'd worn myself for 19 years. "Yes," I said. Maria did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was even and controlled in the way a person's voice is controlled when they are deciding not to fall apart.
"Okay,"
she said. A pause.
"Keep watching."
The fire contracted to the origin circle in under 3 minutes. The column disappeared. The infrared camera went dark. The 4 figures had moved into the timber and were no longer visible. The figure at the center was gone with the fire. The Kettle Fork drainage was silent and still and showed no heat signature, no char, no ash, no evidence on any instrument I had available that a 200-acre fire had burned there 20 minutes earlier. I stood at the Osborne for a long time. The morning light was coming up pale and hazy over the eastern ridges. The sky was already taking on the whitened blue of a smoke season day. The infrared monitor beside the Alidade was dark. The Kettle Fork drainage, 11 miles south in the canyon system below the ridgeline, showed nothing. I did not call in a knockdown. I did not know what the figure in the flames was. I had no framework for it that didn't break under examination. I did not know what the 4 figures walking out of the fire were. I did not know whether Jessica Gonzalez, if that was Jessica Gonzalez in the yellow Nomex shirt, if Maria's recognition of that color and that garment across 11 years of dispatcher's memory meant what it seemed to mean, was alive in any way I would recognize. I did not know if being walked out of the fire was rescue or something else entirely. The notebook's last line was the only testimony I had from someone who had stood in that drainage and tried to understand what they were seeing. And that testimony ended at the moment the figure looked back. Maria's voice came back on Channel 6 about 30 seconds after I confirmed the yellow Nomex shirt.
"Kingston,"
she said.
"The contractor filed an access violation report 40 minutes ago. There's going to be someone at the Wilderness Boundary Trailhead by this afternoon."
I didn't say anything. I was still looking through the telephoto lens at the spot where the 4 figures had disappeared into the timber. The Kettle Fork drainage was quiet and still. No smoke, no heat signature on the infrared camera. Nothing.
"I'm not logging the last event,"
Maria said. "I know that too," I said. She was quiet for a second, and then she said,
"I forwarded the audio file already, to people who will know what to do with it. People Oliver can't call."
I asked who.
"People Oliver can't call,"
she said again, and that was all she said. The channel went quiet. I set the radio down on the Osborne's brass ring and stood there for a minute, just looking out through the glass at the wilderness stretching away in every direction. The morning light was coming up pale and hazy over the eastern ridges. the sky already taking on that whitened blue of a smoke-season day. The Bitterroot ridges ran south as far as I could see, forested and deep, and somewhere 11 miles down in the canyon system, the Kettle Fork drainage lay folded into the landscape, invisible, keeping its own counsel. I thought about what I knew. I knew the contractor's pickup was somewhere on the fire road to the northeast, parked at the wilderness boundary. I knew the contractor would be back, with more documentation and more authority, and that this time there would be consequences that weren't limited to contract termination. I knew Oliver Larson would be told about the audio file within hours of the contractor filing his report, and that Oliver wouldn't be able to protect me even if he wanted to, which I wasn't certain of. I knew Bradley Silva at the Western Fire Accountability Project in Missoula had the audio file. I knew my sister Storm in Boise had it. I knew Maria had it and had already forwarded it to people I didn't know. People who apparently couldn't be called by Oliver, which I assumed meant people outside the agency structure entirely. I knew the field notebook with Jessica Gonzalez's handwriting was in my chest pocket. I knew that what I had set in motion couldn't be called back. I thought about what I didn't know. I didn't know what the figure in the flames was. I had no framework for it that didn't break under examination. I knew it had been in the Kettle Fork since at least 1987, and that 1987 was probably not the beginning. It had been doing what it did, breathing the fire back into itself, processing it, feeding it back through whatever it was, for longer than the Forest Service had been watching, longer than any agency named for the land. I didn't know what the 4 figures walking out of the fire were, or whether Jessica Gonzalez, if that was Jessica Gonzalez in the yellow Nomex shirt, if Maria's recognition of that color and that garment across 11 years of dispatcher's memory meant what it seemed to mean, was alive in any way I would recognize. I didn't know if being walked out of the fire was rescue or something else entirely. The notebook's last line was the only testimony I had from someone who had been close enough to know, and that testimony ended at the moment the figure had looked back. I took the field notebook from my chest pocket and laid it open on the table beside the Osborne, next to my incident journal. Jessica Gonzalez's handwriting was clear and precise in the morning light. Blue ballpoint, careful and technical in the way that a trained analyst's field notes were careful. The page was open to the last entry, dated August 9th, 2017. I'd read it before, down at the origin site with the contractor standing 30 feet away watching me, but I read it again now. "It is not burning," the entry said. "It is processing. The combustion appears to be a byproduct of its presence, not its action." And then, at the bottom of the page, "It saw us when we stopped moving." I read that line twice. Not because I needed to, but because it was the last honest document I had from someone who had stood in that drainage and tried to understand what they were seeing, and it deserved to be read. She had written it down in the moment she realized what was happening, and then she had walked toward the figure anyway. And whatever had happened after that wasn't in the notebook, because there wasn't anyone left to write it down. Until this morning, when I'd watched her walk out of the fire in a yellow Nomex shirt, 11 years after she'd been declared lost. I set the notebook down and looked out through the 360-degree glass at the wilderness running away from me in every direction. The ridges dropped into drainages that dropped into more ridges. 2.3 million acres of steep canyon country with no roads and no trails for the first 6 miles in any direction. I'd been watching it for 32 days now, and I understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent that much time alone with it, that none of it was passive. It kept its own counsel. It had always kept its own counsel. I had been hired to watch it and report what I saw, and I had done that. And the cost of doing it correctly was already in motion and couldn't be called back. I turned away from the window and started to pack. I put the incident journal in my pack first, then the laptop, then the telephoto camera in its padded case. The external hard drive went in next, wrapped in a spare wool shirt to keep it from getting damaged. I put Jessica Gonzalez's notebook in the top of the pack where I could reach it. I left the Osborne where it was, bolted to the cab floor, unchanged since 1940, the kind of instrument that still worked because it had no moving parts that could fail. Someone else would staff this tower next season, if they staffed it at all, and they would use the same brass azimuth ring and alidade that every lookout before me had used, and they would call in fires the same way I had. And maybe they would see something in the Kettle Fork drainage that they couldn't explain, and maybe they would report it, and maybe they wouldn't. That wasn't my problem anymore. I shouldered the pack and adjusted the straps. It wasn't heavy. I'd been living light up here, and I'd be carrying even lighter on the way down. The trail to the wilderness boundary was 6 miles north, and from there it was another 4 miles to the nearest fire road where I'd left my truck back in late May. The contractor would be watching for me, but he couldn't watch every route down, and I knew this country well enough by now to pick a line that wouldn't take me past the trailhead. I looked south one last time through the glass at the pale, clear sky above the Kettle Fork drainage. No smoke, no heat signature, just the ridges and the timber and the canyon system folding in on itself, miles deep, keeping whatever it kept. The sky gave nothing back. I turned away from the window, opened the cab door, and began to descend.